This is Z Smith. He's the principal for the director of building. He's a principal and the director of building performance at SQ Dumas Ripple, which is an architecture and design planning firm here in New Orleans. And he's speaking on affordable, resilient, net zero carbon buildings right here, right now in Louisiana.
Hello. Thank you, Liz, for that. This first is an aerial photograph. You can see the workers installing the solar panels on the roof of a new affordable housing project that is just opened here in New Orleans. And I'll show a little bit more about this project later on. I just have a few slides to walk through to give people a taste. But the big news I think I want to share is that the building community, I guess if you would call it, architects, contractors, and so on, working together in Louisiana and really across the country, are taking on a really aggressive plan to make huge reductions in carbon emissions, really on the kind of 10-year timescale that this series going around the country, that's going on simultaneously around the country, is asking us to address. Next slide. So buildings and construction has a huge impact on carbon emissions worldwide. One thing that would be obvious to people is, you know, if you have a house and you pay a power bill or pay a gas bill, obviously there's emissions that are going on either from your furnace or from the power plant that's remote. And those are, you know, we know about. And so that's the emissions each year. About 28% of all the carbon emissions that are happening due to the buildings that already exist. And each year we might add 1 or 2 or 3% to that stock, depending on how fast buildings construction is growing in a region or buildings are being cycled in. But the other thing that's happening is a realization that's really just come through, and we've been doing the math better in the last few years, is that the buildings that are under construction just this year alone are going to be responsible for, in the making of the concrete, the making of the steel, the fabrication of the wood, and so on, for 11% of all global carbon emissions. And so what we choose to make our buildings out of can have a huge impact on emissions each year. And then finally, where we build the buildings, you know, it's fine to make net zero buildings, but if you make them in a place where people will have to drive to get there, there's going to be a lot of emissions from transportation. And so moving things towards walkable communities where people can, you know, where driving is a choice, not a requirement, is going to be a huge and important part. Now, the American Institute of Architects, of which I'm a member, their membership voted, their 100,000 members nationwide voted last summer to commit architects to net zero design, transitioning from where we are today to net zero over the next 10 years. And we know that this is possible because we've already, for the last 7 years, had in place a tracking mechanism where we are able to do either deep energy retrofits of existing buildings or new construction for buildings that uses 70% less energy than typical buildings. So our goal is to make new buildings or renovated buildings either net zero or net zero ready. Of course, it also highlights that we need to, wherever we can, renovate rather than replace buildings because of the huge carbon emissions associated with new construction. We have to work smarter to not have any lazy steel or any lazy concrete in our buildings. And then we can choose lower carbon materials. The carbon footprint of wood is much less than steel, steel somewhat less than concrete. And in fact, with some new materials that's under development, we can have a building that sequesters more carbon. It locks up carbon in the building structure itself. So all of these things, if you add them up, that's sort of about 60% of all the emissions. And these are all under control of people who are either designing or building new buildings. Next slide, please. To give an example of what a deep energy retrofit can do, this is a not very inspiring looking building from the outside up in Baton Rouge. That's a stack of 8, you could call them pancake floors. And this is on the right-hand side, this is what those buildings look like, what it is to work inside that building. Lighting quality, not so good. Air quality, not so good. Thermal comfort, people complaining of being uncomfortable, and no views to the outside. However, we're able to, through a deep intervention in this building cut its energy use by 70%. Next slide. And turn that into this, where everybody has a view, where people are encouraged to walk up and through this building through a series of open stairs. The head of the firm, it's her plan to each morning walk up the 7 floors to her office as she meets and working with all the employees. So deep energy retrofits can have a huge impact. And this was all motivated not by somebody who wanted to save energy, but they wanted to attract and retain employees. That's what drove this project. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. Deep energy retrofits, oh, go back one, please. Thank you. Deep retrofits can happen at all scales. For example, this is my own home here in New Orleans, where this is a house built in 1880, and through a series of improvements, we were able to cut the energy use by 2/3, and then offset most of the rest of the energy use with some rooftop solar. But another thing that happened 10 years later was we decided, all of our neighbors were getting emergency generators because we get so many power outages here. And instead, we were able to get some Tesla Powerwalls on this house as a way of experimenting with on-site storage. And so that's helped us get to net zero. Next slide, please. And so you can see how that works with a battery system where we're monitoring the solar production from the solar array, the storage into the batteries, and then drawing from the batteries when we need. So this house on this particular day kind of disappeared from the grid for many hours at a time. Next slide. And these same ideas then we were able to apply to this affordable housing project built by SBP, which is a nonprofit that helps people on resilience and helps people recover from climate disasters. This is affordable housing that uses 1/3, it consumes 1/3 as much energy as a typical apartment building. But because those rooftop solar and on-site battery storage, this whole building is able to island, meaning it can detach itself from the grid for hours or days at a time, which is especially important because some of the apartments here are being rented to people who have severe health conditions and might have equipment that needs to keep running. What's really important is that this project was built for $164 a square foot. That number might not mean much, but the average house in New Orleans sells for $165 a square foot. So we're able to do new construction, net zero, affordability, resilient, for an affordable price. Next slide. So, one of the things that we need to take away is what we can all do now. If you are at a high school or you are at a college, I think Alejandro showed what one university is taking on by going through and looking at their bills and working hard to improve things. Buildings, I hope I've convinced you, have a huge impact. But policy can have a huge impact too. As an example, there was a law passed in 2001 that requires the state of Louisiana for every building that's received state money to get built to measure its energy use and identify the bad performers and then set in place a series of policies to improve that and drastically reduce the energy use of those buildings. This law has never actually been funded or implemented, so it's on the books, but there's no staff behind it. This is the kind of thing that at the stroke of a pen, a couple of staff people, there are millions and millions of square feet in state-funded buildings. This could have a huge impact if they were even measuring what the buildings were doing. There's similar actions are being discussed for the city of New Orleans, for any city around the state. These benchmarking ordinances where you measure how good a building is doing compared to other similar buildings could have huge impact by just identifying which are the ones that are worst performers. And so we can start tuning them, bringing their consumption down while our power grid switches over from being fossil fuel fired to clean electric fired. Those are all things that each of us can do. We can take actions in our own lives, but what really matters at the end of the day is how we shift things at the scale of our schools, our universities, our cities, and then the whole state. And that's how we can make huge impact on climate change through our own direct actions. And with that, thank you.